Hey everyone, how's it going? Welcome to the channel, and I am here for a discussion video for you guys. This is a music discussion, and we're going to be talking about basically when vocalists change in bands. Now, obviously, I think we know that this is something that can happen for the better. Sometimes it can happen for the worse. We're going to think of some examples and why, and some of the examples that I can think of on what makes a vocalist change better or for worse. Now, some examples that immediately come to mind are Iron Maiden, Reich, Killswitch Engage to an extent. There's a few bands that come to mind. Now, with Killswitch Engage, I think this example and Iron Maiden's example is pretty similar. Like, even though these bands have had several lineup changes, mainly referring to the vocalists, even though, like, it wasn't like for really better or for worse. Now, obviously, it depends on the time period, I think, but with Killswitch Engage, there's really no wrong answer. I mean, this is a band that has released solid album after solid album. I mean, there's no bad album from Killswitch Engage. Despite the fact that there's been Jesse Leach and Howard Jones as vocalists, throughout the Killswitch Engage discography. And it just seems like no matter who the vocalist is, whether if it's one of those two on the next Killswitch Engage album, it's going to be a darn good album, And that's something that you can say with Iron Maiden too, like with Paul's era with Iron Maiden, the first two albums. I think that era is actually pretty solid. I think that the self-titled album is actually sort of overlooked in a way. I think it deserves more recognition than Killers, but that's of course a bias thing because I really do like the self-titled Iron Maiden album. And I think most Iron Maiden fans don't have a problem with Paul's era with Iron Maiden. I think a lot of people do respect that era of the band. Now, whenever Bruce came in, that's when, the band has really found their signature sound, I guess. Like, they found their this was a groundbreaking moment for the band, I guess. Like, this is where they really knew who they were, who Iron Maiden was. And that's why a lot of people, when they think of the Iron Maiden discography, they think of Bruce's era, of course. And that's specifically because the majority of the discography has Bruce on vocals. And I think a lot of us can agree that, he could stay with Iron Maiden till the end. There's one vocalist that I follow on YouTube who does these Iron Maiden covers, or, he does an impersonation of Bruce from Iron Maiden, and holy cow, he's really got it in him. He's very impressive. This YouTuber is very impressive, how much he sounds like Bruce. Like, he's done videos and covering other songs, like what would happen if Bruce sang for this band or whatever. I mean, he does a really good job. I mean, if we live in a world where, let's say, Bruce does quit Iron Maiden, I think it would be awesome to see this YouTuber join Iron Maiden if, like, Bruce ever got fired or something. I don't think anyone would really have an issue with that. Most people probably wouldn't even notice because he sounds exactly like Bruce. And I think that's another good example of when bands change is, when when a new vocalist comes in, but they don't really sound even much different than the prior vocalists, I think. An example I can think of is with Reich. I've seen some people say that Todd Latour basically sounds like, with his vocals, he basically sounds like he just absorbed Jeff Tate's ability from the 1980s and just came at it with the 2010s albums, the self-titled, Condition Human, and The Verdict. And I can definitely see that. And the three albums with Todd Latour on vocals honestly sounds like this should have been the continuation after Promised Land or something. It's like that Everything Here in the Now Frontier up to Frequency Unknown just seems like it was, sort of like experimenting, because obviously now Todd Latour and his vocals sound more like Queensryche more than Jeff Tate did for the remainder of the late 90s to the early 2010s. So I think that's a good example of vocalist change, like going back to your roots with a different vocalist. Like, because I think I've heard some people say that Todd LaTorre was basically the man that saved Queensryche. And I can certainly see why, because this band would have definitely gone downhill. Now, now, not to disrespect Jeff Tate, of course. Jeff Tate is a great vocalist, but there's no denying that the later days of the 90s and pretty much the remainder of his stuff with Queensryche is not as good as it could have been. I think a lot of people can agree on that. So yeah, that's something that I have to point out as well. I know that he's doing his own stuff, his solo stuff, which, I've met a friend of his, which is pretty cool. That's how I tried to get into contact with him for cameo work and stuff. But yeah, that's besides the point. I just figured that was something worth pointing out. But I think that's another good example of a vocalist changing, I guess. And going back to what I said about Iron Maiden, I think a lot of people have a problem with the Blaze Bayley era just because it's not Bruce. Like, this is something that honestly kind of confuses me, because I like the Blaze Bayley era. Now, sure, I think some of Maiden's worst material came from that era, such as Angel and the Gambler, of course, which is probably the worst Iron Maiden song ever. Sure, that may be the case, but there's still some excellent, solid stuff that came from Blaze's era. Just because it's not Bruce doesn't mean it's a bad era. Paul wasn't Bruce either. And that era gets a lot of praise from people. And he doesn't really sound like Bruce either. Before some people say that, oh, well, Blaze doesn't sound like Bruce. Well, neither did Paul. So that's something to keep in mind as well. I think The X Factor is an excellent album. I think it may be their best album of the 1990s. Either that album or Fear of the Dark, of course. But yeah, I just think that Blaze's era is actually pretty solid. I love the X Factor album. Virtual 11, I think, is okay. Now, let's go ahead and talk about bad examples of vocalists changing. One example that immediately comes to mind is 3 Days Grace. Now, Matt Walst. I think that he's a decent vocalist, but he's not as good as Adam. Okay? I think the problem with 3 Days Grace's latest material, the stuff with Matt Walst, is just the songwriting and the lyrics, especially, when it comes to Human and Outsider. Now, I think that, Matt Walsh with 3 Days Grace, like, this era of the band could be an improvement, of course, like, I think that, they could put out some really solid stuff with Matt Walsh. You know what I'm saying? But it's clear that it's just not as good as Adam's era of 3 Days Grace. I mean, that's for certain. I mean, I think, another bad example, maybe, I don't know, there's a few other examples, but I'm not going to go into many of them. But I think some bad examples would be like, a vocalist that may be worse or doesn't fit that band in particular, or, they just, maybe their songwriting is underwhelming compared to the original vocalist songwriting. It obviously depends on who's writing the songs, of course, but it also depends on the vocal performance as well. Maybe the new vocalist of this band's vocal performance is not as satisfying or as interesting to listen to as the prior vocalist's vocal ranges and performances. Now, there's some bands that I can think of where, I personally just can't imagine them getting a new vocalist. Like Linkin Park. I've heard that Linkin Park is actually writing new music. And it's gonna be interesting to see how they follow up One More Light, the last album with Chester. Now, I don't know if they're going to replace Chester, but if they do replace Chester, hopefully they do it in a way that, isn't a complete stretch away from, Chester's overall vocal performance. I hope that they still do what made Linkin Park really good. I think it would be cool if Linkin Park pulled a Queensryche come back with a different vocalist and also go back to their roots, maybe go back to a new metal sound. You see what I'm saying? And there's some vocalists that I just can't imagine getting a new frontman or a new vocalist. Maybe some of you feel that way with Linkin Park. I personally can't imagine that with bands like Breaking Benjamin, Red, Demon Hunter, Metallica. I can't imagine any of those bands getting new vocalists. With Metallica, I can't ever imagine them replacing James Hetfield. I mean, no one's going to do that same, yeah, like James Hetfield does, of course. And with Demon Hunter, I think all of us can agree that none of us can imagine a Demon Hunter album without Ryan Clark, if they got a different vocalist. The band would surely not perform as well if that were the case. And same with the other bands that I've mentioned. Breaking Benjamin and Red, these two bands, they would fall down without their vocalists. So it really does depend overall. There are some cases where vocalist changing does work, and then there are cases where it doesn't work. And sometimes some bands feel like they don't have a choice but to get another vocalist. Maybe due to the prior vocalist passing or leaving the band or being fired or something. And that's because they do it for the fans. Because fans want new material from these bands. So that's why I feel like sometimes they get a different vocalist, even if it's not as good as the stuff with the previous vocalist. You see what I'm saying? So that's all stuff that I figured was worth keeping in mind. I think this is a pretty interesting concept. Let me know what you guys think. Can you guys think of any examples on a change of vocalists for worse or for better? Feel free to let me know in the comments. So on that note, thanks for watching, have a nice day, and take care.